Good morning.
Good morning.
Some of you know that I am in the process of writing a book that the main title is Wisdom on the Way, and the subtitle is World Viewing Through the Chaos to See Ourselves Whole. So I thought this morning I'd zoom in on the last part of that subtitle, to see ourselves whole, because some of what I've been reading lately has really opened my eyes to what's involved in wholeness by looking at the different ways we respond to being broken. What determines the shape of my life? Is it my environment, the genetic code that sets forth who I am? Unconscious drives that are able to masquerade as high ideals? How much of my life experience depends on me, and how much is beyond my control, maybe even beyond my influence? What I'd like to explore this morning is a layer of experience between cause and effect, between input and outcome, something irreducibly human in the heart of how we live. Experiences don't just happen to me. I continuously interpret my world. I make sense of the situation, or I try to, and all that I experience is shot through with meaning, with significance, with the potential of what it might have meant or what else it could be. And how could I process all that information, all that possibility, all those combinations of responses if I didn't always already bring to my experience some idea of what to expect? Patterns I might encounter, shortcuts to decide by. We all live by rough measures of who we are and what our world is like. That is unavoidable. Unavoidable, too, that these beliefs work like assumptions, tested to some extent on the road of life, but hardly proven, much less infallible. So, what would happen if an assumption I've been living by turned out to be wrong? And could I even know how long and how difficult the process to find out that I'm living a mistake? What if that belief that served me well once in an earlier situation now drives me, let's say, into dangerous relationships or into conditions that are not contributing to me having a better life, but a worse one? We can hope that we could change any of our beliefs as soon as we saw that they weren't working, that there was some contrary evidence, and we can, I'm sure, change many of them, but perhaps there are assumptions that we have that are deeper than that are governing assumptions, in the sense that you might be living under fascist rule and are governed by that without having the liberties we presume in a democracy like ours, in our own governments of mind. Perhaps we too have enforcers for certain rules that we might not even consciously know we're living by, or understand what governs the assumptions behind or underneath our actions. Could it be that I have beliefs about myself or about my world that are fixated, that got stuck at an earlier point in my life, perhaps even before I can remember back to? Is it possible that I have governing assumptions that I do not allow myself to question, or that hide themselves in my life so well that I don't even know they're there? Howard Schubiner makes a helpful distinction between belief and mere thought. He writes, "There is something incredibly powerful in belief. It is a deeper and more emotional process than simply knowing something on a cognitive level. Thoughts are based on ideas that can be altered as new information arises. Beliefs are convictions that are known to be true and are not easily alterable. Now, we might say that we have different levels of beliefs. What he's talking about are the motivating beliefs that shape our values and our choices in the deepest priorities of life. Howard Schubert presents stunning medical evidence of the power of belief in his recent book, Unlearn Your Pain. For over 20 years, he has doctored patients with incurable pains, often with no clear medical cause. He found that most of the chronic pain from certain of these conditions is functional in nature rather than what medical professionals call structural. That is, the pain is real, but there isn't something wrong in the patient's body that would account for that pain. Part of his analysis of what's happening is that pain doesn't come from the place on your skin that's broken, it comes from the brain. There's a signal, we presume, that links what's happening on the skin and the receptors there with what's going on in the brain. But it's the brain that interprets the experience as pain. And part of what he says throughout this book, part of what he demonstrates, to me conclusively, the brain uses a predictive model of processing. So if the brain thinks that there might be something wrong, the brain can send a signal of pain to reach you in a language you'll understand, which means that you can have the experience of something hurting in your body when there's nothing really wrong with that part of your body. That's what pain can be. And that is, in fact, what he finds in many cases that it is. I'm going to skip ahead to something I found absolutely fascinating, because let's suppose I had a hip that was bugging me for over a month. And, well, go get an image of that. See what the MRI or the X-ray says. Suppose it had been my back, and I got an X-ray. Let's say an MRI of my back. I think that's what this refers to. And they said, oh, well, you show some disc degeneration, disc bulge, and disc protrusion. So with these three factors, of course you're going to have significant back pain. How are we going to medicate this? How are we deal with these physical conditions? That's what we're going to do for you. And if that doesn't work, we'll find a more invasive procedure, because this is what's causing your pain. Okay? Dig this. There's a chart in his book that lists several different types of back conditions that could show up on an MRI. And I just wrote down the ones for the three that I just mentioned: disc degeneration, disc bulge, and disc protrusion. And there's a chart that's organized by age. What percentage of people in this set of people had this at age 20, 30, 40, 50, 60? I stopped at 70 because I don't want to think too far ahead. Not about these things. At age 70, for the sample he was referring to of MRIs that were conducted for research purposes, at age 70, 93% of the sample had disc degeneration, 77% a disc bulge, 40% disc protrusion. For age 40, it was 68%, 50%, and 33% dig disc. For age 20, 37% showed disc degeneration, 30% showed a disc bulge, and 29% disc protrusion.
So it's normal.
Now let me tell you who this sample is. These are people who had an MRI done for research purposes, but who reported no symptoms or notable pain. In other words, 93% of 70-year-olds who don't report pain have that condition. And yet, if I do report pain and I'm found to have this condition that 93% of people without pain have, I'm found to have that. Now we know what your problem is, don't we? Welcome to the medical model. This, to me, I skipped ahead to that because it's a really direct way of getting at what he's talking about, which is that how we understand what's happening to us has an awful lot to do with what we expect and what happens with us under those conditions. So what he has found and given evidence for over 20 years is that most of the chronic pain is functional rather than structural, And through years of research and rigorous experiment, he does studies that are as controlled as they can make them for the circumstances they're talking about. He's shown that much of our chronic and debilitating pain comes not from broken bodies, but from disabling beliefs. And that sounds crazy at first because it contradicts a governing assumption of the medical model, which is, if a persistent pain is real rather than imagined, it must have a persisting structural cause. Therefore, think about this from the patient's point of view. If I go to a doctor and the doctor says, well, there's nothing wrong with your back, what am I going to think the doctor's telling me?
Exaggerating.
You're imagining it. You're just trying to get attention. You're looking for excuses for why your life is, whatever. There's no way I'm going to interpret that as empowering, is there?
No.
You're going to go find another doctor who will tell you that the reason.
But when I find that doctor, and that doctor says this is the structural cause, now I have a diagnosis. Now there's something wrong with me. Now I'm a broken person. And I can join a support group to tell me that broken people like me are never going to get better, but with people like us together, we can live with it. So it's almost a vicious spiral to believe that there's something irredeemably broken about me. On the other hand, if there's nothing wrong with me, then you're saying it's in my head, and that's an insult. And so on the medical model, there's great difficulty reconciling the reality of pain with the absence of a structural cause. What Schubinner's trying to get to is a mind-body model of understanding that sees the whole person, which is a kind of watchword in humanistic approaches to behavioral health especially. You deal with the whole person in an individualized way to the extent you're able. But when we see that clearly, then this overthrows our view of things through the medical model. When the doctors can't identify the problem clearly, then the longer the pain persists, the more diagnoses get piled on. The more drugs get prescribed, the more side effects accumulate, which means you need more drugs and eventually more invasive procedures.
The more broken you get.
Exactly. And in fact, the social critic Ivan Ilyich was arguing about that 50 years ago, that the medical model kind of makes us medically worse. That's an aside.
The more broken you are, the more broken you get.
Yes. Okay, they're good and bad snowballs, I guess.
The more money you make.
So the more invasive procedures are tried, this often accelerates the patient's decline. But when we overthrow the governing assumption of the medical model, we can replace that with curiosity. Does your pain ever move? If I broke my right arm, my left arm wouldn't hurt tomorrow morning. But a pain that doesn't have a clear structural cause might move around. It might change in intensity with time or even with conditions like the weather or that sort of thing. What was going on in your life when you first had that pain? Oh, okay. How about when it came back unexpectedly 2 years later? What was going on in your life then? In many, many, many cases, it turns out that there are unfinished situations in people's lives, like trauma, multiple adverse experiences sometimes before we can remember, or just ordinary life stress, a business, a marriage, finances, all kinds of things that can really take a toll on our psyches. So the insight of a Gestalt approach to psychology is that you can only understand the part of yourself that might be problematic or that you want to improve by understanding the whole. The Gestalt perspective, which dates back to the 20s and the German experimenters in perception and then carried through all the way to Fritz Perls and other therapists of a humanistic tradition up till today. The Gestalt perspective is that unlike the reductionist perspective of earlier science and earlier psychology, it's not that our experiences are built up from the atoms of individual events and individual actions happening in the brain. Rather, the whole shapes the context in which those events and actions and other things take on the meaning they have in our lives. And that when something isn't working, it's not because that thing must be broken in this mechanical process, but because the patterns of meaning don't fit together right. It's not a good gestalt. So to be whole from a gestalt perspective is that I recognize all the different facets of who I am as a human being. I recognize my past, my bearing toward the future, the tensions that sometimes feel like a magnetic field where I'm trapped in attraction and repulsion at the same time. Because that tension I feel means that there's some unfinished situation in my life. And what Schubiner is showing is that in many, 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 many cases, that tension that may have come from some other kind of difficulty in my life or some other experience that I didn't acknowledge, that can express itself in my body. So I don't want to just focus on body stuff today, but this is why I think this is so significant. Schubiner says at one point, or maybe I think Joe Dispenza says this, not Schubiner. Dr. Joe Dispenza has some very similar arguments that he takes a little farther in some ways, and he says, in our society, if you talk to people in terms of anything spiritual or religious, you're going to divide your audience like crazy. The fundamentalists versus they're all over the different places. In our society, what most people can accept, I have to put in the most because there's some audiences where vaccines and stuff, science is what is non-mystical to, let's say, relatively educated, relatively open-minded, relatively reasonable audiences today. And so if you're not trying to speak to people who have dinosaurs and humans in the same diorama, then you can pretty much use scientific language to get across the notion that you're not making this up. Now, when I was a kid, I would hear about primitive societies that believed in voodoo. Like, a hex or something like that. It turns out that if you live in a culture where that is the norm and that is the belief that is a shared belief and was authoritative through your life, you can die from voodoo.
It has an impact.
Yeah.
It has an impact. And it may, I would argue, not just because you individually believe it, but because your belief is rooted in a cultural context that has authority in your life. Similarly, miracle cures. Oh, Jesus Christ, Lord above, I can walk. Oh, praise God, I am saved, I can walk. How many of us would ridicule anyone who took that seriously? Some of us, coming from a humanist perspective, would say, that faith healing stuff is just crap. You want to believe it, it's wishful thinking. You're driven to believe it by some crazy, twisted religious perspective. Check out some of the stuff that happens with real people's real cures and how they get there. It's hard to distinguish that from faith healing. And I'm going to give you a couple examples as we go here, since I'm past my chart and we can look at another way of explaining where the pain comes from. One example is a woman named Fiona whose pain started when she fell off a horse at age 10. The acute knee injury healed a few weeks later, but 6 months later she developed back and hip pain that didn't have any injury causing it. Symptoms escalated and her life grew smaller with the years. The chronic fatigue support group confirmed that she would never recover, though she could manage her symptoms to some extent. For another 14 years, Fiona resigned herself to persistent pain that prevented her from leaving her parents' house, working, exercising, traveling, or having a social life. Now think for a minute, imagine it. after the early stuff. 14 years living like that. Then there's an app that has an advertisement when she's scrolling through. The app is called Curable, and the third time it came up, she was so pissed about it. She said, all right, I'm going to enroll to prove that mind-body treatment could never work. Well, so much for the need for a positive attitude, because what happened as she started into that process, she noted that there was variation in her symptoms, and she wondered why. She noted that she had had past stress and, in fact, significant trauma that she hadn't shared with anyone because she'd been threatened if she told, etc. She'd been bullied at school and the teachers looked the other way. She'd been sexually assaulted as a child by a teen who threatened that if she told, she'd have very bad things happen. But when she devoted herself to the exercises, persevered, tested herself, when she saw a therapist for trauma issues, she recovered within a couple of months and was pain and fatigue-free for 7 years. Up to that point. In other words, it was still going on. So imagine 14 years like that, and then you find out, well, this is essentially not from a broken something here, but because, in essence, somebody broke you when you were a kid in a traumatic way, and you never were able to resolve that. I don't want to imply that all these cases have trauma behind them, but there's a tremendous correlation. And many of the kinds of cases he's talking about are cases where, from a personality standpoint, there may be 5 times as many women as men with a certain condition, and these are often women who've grown up to believe that they can't put themselves first, they can't assert for themselves, that the socially appropriate role for a woman is. So through all these things, we shape a sense of who we are, but we can also shape a possibility of being something greater. Fiona said, throughout my illness, gradually over time, without consciously deciding this, I took on the identity of a sick person, of someone who had severe limitations and severe symptoms. I saw myself and defined myself that way, and many others saw me and defined me the same way. The book is full of cases like this, and Dr. Jody Dispenza's books like You Are the Placebo and Becoming Supernatural are equally filled with things that are, in many cases, painstakingly researched. In almost every case, the critical moment came when the patient was willing to interpret their pain in a completely different way from what many doctors had declaimed with authority. They could instead become curious about what their pain might mean, what message their brain might be sending in a language they could understand, and instead of assuming that only bones and muscles could cause pain, they realized how pain could be an expression of the whole person, of emotions repressed or denied, of what they knowingly or unknowingly assumed about themselves and their potentials. I was fascinated that it's not only the patients. I'm pretty late into reading this book, and he says, I got kind of a pain one time that stuck around a little while. What had happened was he was getting ready to retire from the hospital he'd worked at to switch over to another way of doing his work when he was called in and basically fired. And he realized that he'd never been making money for the hospital. He didn't have an approach that was insurance friendly. He believed in gathering a lot of information and doing a lot of face talking to people, which insurance doesn't give you money hand over fist for. So he understood it cognitively, but he was pissed. He fantasized about, just in a cartoon way, about kind of like Wile E. Coyote blowing up the hospital and that kind of thing. But he was getting this pain. It was, where's this pain coming from? And here's somebody who spent his life, spent over 20 years studying this thing. And so he worked through the pain, he worked through the sadness, the disappointment, he worked through the guilt about wanting to blow up the hospital in a cartoon kind of way, and he came out the other side. But there was another story, too, of a woman that was a protege of his who had worked with patients that had these problems. She heard about his work, she contacted him, and she went gung-ho on this and was reaching a point where she had to go on and do something else. She's trying to convince the institution that she worked for that they should turn this over to, and they said, nah, because it didn't fit the medical model.
Right.
So she started having pains, and it's a similar story, and she worked through that stuff, but this is why I found that fascinating. I have believed in my own life that if I do the good Socrates philosopher thing and I do the good psychology thing of understanding and knowing myself and working through all of that, that I can be all right. What this shows is that part of the whole of myself is my interface with my social world. And if institutions have different values from me, and if I bump up against an institution that slams the door in my face, that's part of my experience. And it's great challenge for me to interpret that as something I've chosen when a door got slammed in my face. So that's why I found that element of it very, very interesting. It also suggests, as he says, that all of us in life have these conditions that are functional rather than structural that will come up, whether it's in our bodies or in anxiety or depression, which he also includes in the same basket. And so the suggestion there is that even the most aware people can be challenged by those underlying restrictions. So where I want to go with that is from the brokenness to what it means to be whole. And I want to suggest that the weirdo stuff that really goes against that model invites me to wonder just what is possible. And I'm going to give you an example. I mentioned Dr. Joe Dispenza, who's written a number of books. In his book, You Are the Placebo, he describes an accident he had when he was biking. And he was hit by a car. That's the end of this book. Yeah. He was hit by a car, flung far, broke 6 vertebrae. Bone fragments were compressed toward the spine. And the doctors said, we're going to perform surgery and install rods, and if we don't do that, you'll certainly be paralyzed. He said no. He's a chiropractor.
Oh.
So he knows about the skeletal stuff. He's got the medical perspective. He said no. That's weird. He was told he was the only patient out of hundreds that had ever refused that surgery. The reason he said no is that he'd been working on a model of mind-body relationship and resources of healing that he strongly believed in. So he had friends take him home. He had enough support resources to be able to have some people physically take care of him, where he went through a process of strengthening his mind, to visualize himself fully healthy, and then to incrementally work at doing that with his body until he reached the point that he was fully recovered. That took 9.5 weeks. Isn't that incredible? So, if a Christian told me that a Christian person, as opposed to some New Age mind-body philosopher person, that a Christian person had turned it over to Jesus, and 9.5 weeks later, from the same set of x-rays at the beginning, had reached that point of full recovery, and they said, see, faith healing is legitimate, who would I be to say no? Who would I be to say, I don't like your religion, so that faith can't possibly do you any good? I think this is a call to be open-minded, not only about what might be possible in our lives, but the range of possibilities we sometimes reject that we might give at least a little bit of credence to. And I want to end by noting that there's an ambiguity when I talk about seeing ourselves whole. I've mainly focused on the individual, but I think if we look at our society as torn, in many ways broken, I can wonder about American democracy the way a person might wonder about their back. And the underlying point for me in this is that when we see oppositions as absolute, there's the body and there's the mind, it's got to be one or the other. It can't be something. When we see those absolute distinctions, we're not looking at it in the spirit of Gestalt perception, Gestalt psychology, because the very perspective of Gestalt is these two things, even if you can't see them both at once, you only have one when you have the other. It's not contradiction. It is a contrast that is complementarity. And so if we can, in our divided society, reach for those perspectives where we can see us complementing each other, there may be some hope for that, not only for the individual wholeness of ourselves, perhaps even our fraught project of democracy. Thank you very much.